Good morning, students. It's the 2nd of February, 2021. This will be our first lecture of this week. The second one will be on Thursday, I'm pretty sure. Today we're going to continue our discussion of utilitarianism, specifically act utilitarianism, and we're working our way through chapter 2 right now. I set aside 4 days for chapter 2. This was the third of 4 days. So today I'm going to cover just one section of chapter 2. It's the section entitled Utility. And that means on Thursday we will wrap up chapter 2 by discussing the final section, which is some additional, let me find the actual title, defective formulations of act utilitarianism. Remember, there are 9 formulations altogether. Feldman designates them with subscripts. So they're U sub 1, U sub 2, all the way to U sub 9. And you have to remember that the correct formulation is U sub 7. So Feldman works his way up to U sub 7 by looking at 6 defective formulations. And once he arrives at the correct formulation, U sub 7, he continues with 2 additional defective formulations. So we're working our way through these formulations right now. The last one we looked at was U sub 3, which goes like this. I'm looking at page 22. An act is right if and only if it causes pleasure and does not cause pain. Now we saw that there are 2 counterexamples to that. There are cases such as the fossil case, which cause pleasure and do not cause any pain. And yet, according to U sub 3, that act would be right. And yet, it seems to us to be wrong. What the graduate student did in throwing away that bone was wrong, most of us would say. And yet, according to U sub 3, it turns out to be right because it caused some pleasure to the graduate student who used it as a toothpick. And it didn't cause any pain to anybody because the student never told the professor that the bone had been found. So what you don't know can't hurt you or harm you or cause you pain. The other case that serves as a counterexample to this is the snake bite case. This is a case where you push someone out of the way of a snake, and in doing so you cause some pain to that person who maybe fell into a cactus. So there you have a case where somebody did cause pain, and yet the act seems right anyway. It seems like the right thing to do. So U sub 3 has a couple of serious problems. Right? It gives the wrong criterion of rightness. So let's try to diagnose the problem. The problem that we seem to be having is that we're dealing with all or nothing. Does the act cause any pleasure at all? Does it cause any pain at all? What we need is some way of measuring the amount or quantity of pleasure and pain. So let's introduce a new concept. It's the concept of utility. The concept of utility, according to Feldman, allows acts or actions to be ranked, quote, in terms of how much pleasure and how much pain they cause. So the idea is, at any given moment, there are a number of acts that are available to you. There are a number of things you can do at any given moment. You should rank them in terms of how much utility they will produce. And whichever act is at the top of the ranking would be the right thing to do. So here are some of the assumptions that we need to make in order for this to work. First of all, we must assume that pleasure can be quantified. Pleasure can be measured and quantified. Let's introduce a term. Excuse me, I had to stifle a sneeze. Let's introduce a term, the term hedons, Hedons. A hedon, we will say, is a unit of pleasure. And it comes from the Greek word hedoni, which means pleasure. So it's an appropriate term for the unit of pleasure. And by the same token, let's coin a new term, dolors, for units of pain. The word dolor comes from a Latin word, the Latin word dolor, which means pain or grief. So we now have two new terms, hedon and dolor, and that means we can talk about how many hedons a particular act will produce or bring about. How many dolors will a particular act bring about? We're now in a position to quantify or measure the amounts of pain and pleasure we produce or might produce. The third assumption we need to make is that pain and pleasure are commensurable. Commensurable means capable of being compared to one another. Now, you've probably heard the expression apples and oranges. When people use that expression, what they're saying is that the two things in question are not comparable. You can't compare apples and oranges. Well, we don't want something like that. We want something that's comparable. So we want pain and pleasure to occupy the same scale. So think of there being a scale, or just think of a straight line. And think of pleasure being at one end and pain at the other end. A particular act may produce this much pain and pleasure. And if you increase the amount of pleasure, you move it a little bit toward the pleasure end of the spectrum. If you produce some pain, it moves in the other direction. So pleasure and pain occupy the same scale. They can be compared to one another. And so utilitarians, of course, want to produce as much pleasure as possible, minus the pain. So let's turn to a handout that I prepared for you. I'm going to hold up my copy of it. It's a 2-page handout, but I printed mine on one sheet of paper to save paper. Here's the front of the handout, and here's the back. The back is a very long footnote. I'm quoting Bentham. Now, let's turn to the front. The title of this handout is Jeremy Bentham's Felicific Calculus, and that's what he called it. Felicific is a fancy word for happiness. So when you say Feliz Navidad, you're saying Happy Christmas or Merry Christmas. So this is literally Jeremy Bentham's happiness calculator. This is how you go about calculating the amount of pleasure and pain produced by your actions. Now notice the structure of this handout, which I created to illustrate how you do a calculation. Notice it has 4 columns. The leftmost column is entitled Act, and you see down below it the letters A, B, and C. So what I'm doing here is I'm assuming for the purposes of discussion that there are 3 different acts that are available to you at this moment. Act A, Act B, and Act C. Now there may be more than that, but to simplify our discussion, let's just assume there are 3 acts available. The second column is headed Who Affected? Who is affected by each of these acts? And I chose capital letters to represent the different individuals who are affected. So if you take a look at that column, for Act A, you'll see that there are 3 different individuals who are affected one way or another by this act. Individuals S, T, and U. And down below that you see the totals. For Act B, you'll see that some of the same individuals who are affected by Act A are also affected by Act B, should I choose that. Act B has an effect on S, T, V, and W. So 2 of the individuals are the same. Act A affects S and T, so does Act B. But notice, Act A has an effect on individual U, and Act B does not have any effect on individual U. So there are different combinations of individuals who are affected by different acts. And if you look down below at C, you'll see the same thing, different combinations. The third column is headed How Affected. In general, if my act has an effect on you, it could affect you in either or both of 2 ways. It could bring about some pleasure for you, or it could inflict some pain on you. And it can even do both. A particular act might have 2 different effects on the same individual. So to reflect that possibility, look at the column entitled How Effective. Look at how Act A affects individual S. Do you see what I'm looking at now? Act A has an effect on individual S. How specifically does that act affect S? Well, if you look at the third column, you'll see I have plus 10, comma, 0. The plus 10 represents the amount of pleasure that Act A causes to individual S. What that means is that if I were to perform Act A, it would make individual S 10 units happier than S was. Okay, so obviously S would like that, right? S would say, I like this act. I hope you perform Act A because that will make me 10 units happier. But keep in mind, my act could also possibly cause pain to this individual. In fact, in my example, it doesn't. You'll see the 0 there. It says plus 10, comma, 0. That means no pain was inflicted on individual S. If there were any pain inflicted, you would see a minus sign. So what would be the net effect of Act A on individual S? Simply add together the two values. Plus 10 added to 0 gives you the result plus 10. So in the fourth column, you'll see what I wrote. Net effect. If I were to perform Act A, the net effect of that act on individual S would be plus 10. It would make S 10 units happier. Okay, go down to individual T. Look at Act A's effect on individual T. You'll see that this time the act has a different effect. In fact, it produces 5 units of pleasure on individual T, but also 5 units of pain. And you can try to think of an example where the same act produces both pleasure and pain to somebody in a way that they offset. So what's the net effect of Act A on individual T? You can see in the final column, it's 0. Right? Sum together, plus 5 and minus 5, and you get 0. So all things considered, T is unaffected by Act A, right? Because the pain and pleasure offset one another. Individual U, unfortunately, gets no pleasure from Act A, but suffers 3 units of pain. So obviously, individual U won't like this. The Act A, if I were to perform it, would have a net effect of minus 3 on individual U. So the other thing I did for each act is I summed up all of the pleasures, pains, and the net effect. So if Act A affects only 3 individuals, S, T, and U, and if it affects them in the way I described on this handout, then what would be the grand net effect of Act A? If I were to perform Act A, it would produce 7 units of pleasure. You see that? It's in boldface type under in the totals row of Act A. So what that means is if I were to perform Act A, it would make the world 7 units happier. It would, on balance. Right? When you subtract the pain from the pleasure, you're left with 7 units of pleasure or happiness. Because remember, Bentham and Mill equated happiness and pleasure. Okay, I'm not going to belabor this, but look at Act B. Act B, we are assuming, affects 4 different individuals, S, T, V, and W. In the third column, you can see exactly how those individuals are affected. In column 4, you can see the net effect of Act B on each of the 4. And when you add up the sums in the fourth column, you get plus 10. So Act B has a net effect of making the world 10 units happier. It brings about a net balance of 10 units of pleasure. Okay, Act A was plus 7. Act B is plus 10. Act C, the third act, affects 3 individuals. You can see how it affects them. It affects them exactly the same, doesn't it? S, U, and V all are made 1 unit happier, and not one of them is made to suffer any pain. So the net effect of Act C is +3. So let's step back for a moment and think about this. I've made a number of assumptions just for purposes of illustration. What I've assumed is that there are 3 possible acts available to you at this moment, and I labeled them A, B, and C. The next step is to think about who would be affected by those acts if you were to perform them. Remember, you get to be counted. The act might affect you, the agent, as well as others. So you have to look at everyone who's affected by the act. Everyone must be taken into account according to utilitarianism. The next thing you must do once you identify who will be affected is ask how specifically will each individual be affected, and that's column 3. And then when you're done, and when you do that for all 3 of the acts, you have 3 values remaining: the net effect of performing Act A, the net effect of performing Act B, and the net effect of performing Act C. And according to Act Utilitarianism, according to Bentham, the right thing to do is to produce the greatest net amount of utility or happiness. So which act of the 3 that we're discussing would be the right thing to do? According to Bentham, it would be Act B, because +10 is higher than +7 or +3. So B would be the right act to perform. In fact, B would be obligatory, not just permissible, but it would be obligatory. Remember what obligatory means? It's right to do it and wrong not to. If you were to perform Act A, you would be acting wrongly. If you were to perform Act C, you would be acting wrongly. The only way to act rightly in this example is to perform Act B. So B is not only right, it's obligatory. A and C are not only wrong, they're forbidden. Remember what forbidden means? Wrong to perform it and right not to. So utilitarianism, once it creates a ranking from high to low, the act at the very top is obligatory, and all of the other ones, no matter how close they come to the top, all of them are forbidden. Okay? So let me now, the rest of the handout just breaks down in some detail the things that Bentham looked at in order to come up with these numerical values. He looked at the intensity of the pleasure or pain, for example. So other things being equal, a more intense pleasure is worth more than a less intense pleasure. Intensity is a good thing when you're talking about pleasures. Intensity is a bad thing when you're talking about pain. Other things being equal, an intense pain is worse than a less intense pain. He also looked at how certain it is that the pleasure or pain will come about if you were to perform the act. He looked at whether the pleasure or pain will come quickly after the act is performed or further down the road. And we can give names to that. We can talk about whether the pain or pleasure are proximate to the act or remote from the act. Some of our actions produce effects way into the future. Some of the effects of our acts occur right away. Some of them occur a few days later, or weeks, or months, or even years. It's possible for something that you do today to have causal effects years from now. Imagine, this is terrible, but imagine somebody planting a bomb in the woods. That bomb maybe the bomb is set to go off when someone steps on it. It could be decades before someone wandering through the woods steps on the bomb and causes an explosion that may end up in killing somebody, the person who steps on it, for example. So some of the causal upshots of our actions, whether it's pleasure or pain, occur far into the future. Now, a nicer example, suppose you create a trust fund and you leave your wealth behind in posterity for a particular group. All of the individuals who are now alive may be long gone, but your organization may continue in effect And the proceeds of your bequest, your gift, will be distributed far into the future, long after you're gone, and maybe everyone during your lifetime is dead. So that would be a way to do good far into the future. All right. So you can look at Bentham's list. If you want, you can read the long footnote, which I'll mention in a moment. Okay, so now that we have introduced the concept of utility, I want to, and explored Bentham's felicific calculus, I want to help you understand it by discussing a few features. Before I do that, I want to quote Feldman from page 24. Feldman says on page 24, "The utility of an act is the result of subtracting the sum of the doloric value of all the episodes of pain that would occur as consequences of that act from the sum of the hedonic values of all the episodes of pleasure that would occur as consequences of that act." So what Feldman is describing is what we just went over on my handout. And that's the point of my handout, is to show you an actual working out of this calculus. Now, Feldman gives a couple of examples of his own on page 25. I call them the bully case and the assassin case, and I'll let you look at them on your own. Okay, here are the things I want to talk about. You need to keep your handout in front of you. I'm going to refer to it as we go. The first point I want to make about this is that the fact that there are net losers doesn't matter. It has no effect on the decision about which act is the right act to perform. Now, what do I mean by that? Net losers. How many net losers are there if I were to perform Act A? How many individuals end up with a minus sign in column 4? Take a look. Act A, column 4, only one loser, and that is the unfortunate individual U. Individual U ends up 3 units worse off if I choose Act A. So one net loser. How many net losers are there in Act B? Count them. S is minus 3 and W is minus 2. So there are 2 net losers in Act B if I were to perform that act. How many net losers are there in Act C? 0. Notice, they're all plus signs, +1, +1, +1. So in order, we had 1 net loser, 2 net losers, and 0 net losers. Does that matter? You can probably guess, no. According to Bentham and Mill, it doesn't matter that your action produces net losers. It doesn't matter how many net losers your act produces. All that matters is that final value, either +7, +10, or +3. How those values came about doesn't matter. In that sense, this theory, utilitarianism, is a bottom line theory. It looks at only one thing, the bottom line. How much does it add up to? Okay, so you might not like this. You might say, I don't like it that Act B is the right act to perform because it made 2 people less happy than they were to begin with. What made Act B right, as you can see, was that individual T ended up with +10. Right? That's a big gain in pleasure or happiness. And it's big enough to offset the -3 and the -2 that were suffered by S and W, respectively. Now, you may take a look at Act C and say, why is C not correct? Nobody has a net loss. Everybody is a little bit happier. The problem is they're only a very little bit happier. +1, +1, +1. All it adds up to is a measly +3. So if your goal is to make the world as happy a place as you can, which is what you're required to do according to this theory, you've got to choose Act B, even though it makes 2 people less happy than they were before you performed that act. Okay, next thing is related to this, or really it's the flip side. Does the number of net winners matter? And you can probably figure out what I mean by that. It's the number of people who end up with a plus sign in front of their final value. How many net winners are there with Act A? Take a look at the handout, just one. How many net winners are there with Act B? Two. How many net winners are there with Act C? Three. So you might think C is the correct act because three people are made happier, but that would be incorrect. Utilitarianism doesn't care at all about how many people are made happier. It's not about the number of happy people, it's about the amount of happiness, total. Okay, I'm trying to help you understand the theory. You might not like what you're hearing, and what you're hearing might be so offensive to you that you decide right then and there, I'm not a utilitarian. I don't like it that the number of happy people doesn't matter. I don't like it that the number of unhappy people doesn't matter. But utilitarians aren't concerned about that. Their goal is to make the universe, the world, as happy a place as it can be, and it doesn't matter how the happiness gets distributed among people. Okay? It's the total amount. Okay, number 3, my third point. The agent of the act could be any of these individuals. When you're performing an act, you get to count the effect of your act on your own happiness or unhappiness. But your happiness or unhappiness doesn't count for any more than anyone else's. You have to be strictly impartial between yourself and others. As Bentham famously put it, according to Mill, nobody has been able to find these words in Bentham's writings. But Mill knew Bentham, and Mill must have heard Bentham say this, and he wrote it down in his book, Utilitarianism. What Mill says that Bentham said is everybody to count for one, nobody for more than one. Everybody to count for one, nobody for more than one. And that suggests that Bentham required strict equality. Everybody gets counted, but nobody gets counted for more than anyone else. Notice the radical implications of this, and this is why Bentham's theory was so scandalous when he proposed it. Bentham is saying that the happiness of the King or Queen of England is no more important morally than the happiness of a maid in someone's house, or a servant, or someone who works in a livery stable with horses, or the local blacksmith or butcher. Everyone's happiness gets counted and counted equally. Many people saw this as a leveling doctrine. It takes no account of social status, wealth, power, or anything else. Everybody gets counted. There's something noble about that, isn't there? Bentham said that everybody, whatever his or her station in society, everybody counts. Everybody matters. So let me go back to my point. Suppose you are individual S. You are the person deciding what to do, and you are S. How do you fare personally in each of these 3 acts? Act A, S comes out 10 units ahead, plus 10. Act B, S makes you 3 units less happy than you were. Act C, S comes out 1 unit better off or happier. So, if all you were concerned with was your own happiness, you would prefer which act? You would prefer Act A. The last act you would want, if you were S, is B. And B, as we saw, is the right thing to do. So you, S, have to perform Act B, even though it makes you worse off, right? You're 3 units worse off. Sometimes utilitarians end up doing things that work against their own interests. It makes things that inflict pain on them. And the reason they are required to do it is because it has the best overall effect on the world. You're not the only person who matters. Everyone else matters as well as you. Sometimes you end up losing out. Think of it as voting. Do we let people who are very political, imagine somebody who's very interested in politics, cares very much about it, someone who's very knowledgeable about politics, knows all the candidates, knows where they stand on all the issues, and so on. Compare that person to someone who barely follows politics, someone who's not that interested in it, but tries to get to the polls every 4 years to vote for a presidential candidate. Now, do we let the person who's very political have more than one vote, or have more votes than the person who's apolitical? No, we do not. There's a saying, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled many years ago, they gave this the name, one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. Everybody gets one vote. You don't get 2 or 3 because you're rich or powerful or you think highly of yourself. You get one vote. And nobody is reduced to 0, right? If you satisfy the requirements for voting eligibility, you get to vote. No matter how ignorant you are of the candidates or the issues, you still get one vote. Right? It respects the dignity of people. You don't get shut out from voting just because other people think you don't know enough. And you don't get to vote more often just because you are very interested in it and care very much about the result of the election. And the reason I mentioned voting as our analogy is that sometimes when you vote, you lose. Right? You cast your vote, you go home, you watch the election returns come in. Sometimes you end up happy. Yay, my candidate won. I'm so happy. Sometimes you end up disappointed. Oh, darn it. I cast my vote for so-and-so and so-and-so lost. And that the same thing is true in the utilitarian calculus. You are the agent. You are deciding what to do. You're trying to make the world as happy a place as you can. Your own happiness gets counted in the mix, but no more than anyone else's. Sometimes you'll end up being a net loser once you decide what to do. Sometimes you'll end up being a net winner. Okay? You don't know in advance whether you'll be happier or less happy as a result of what you do. Your goal is not focused on your own happiness, remember, but on overall happiness. Okay, 4th point. I'm working my way through. I have 8 of these. Guess who else counts besides human beings? Human beings are sentient or sentient. It's pronounced in different ways. Sentient. Sentient means capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, or capable of suffering. You and I are sentient. That means we can suffer. We can experience pleasure and pain. So can animals. Most animals are sentient. Dogs, cats, cows, pigs, horses, chickens, maybe even fish. Rats, mice, animals that are used in experiments, and that'll be the topic in my biomedical ethics course tomorrow. For a moment, I forgot which lecture I was giving. But rats and mice are sentient beings, and the utilitarian would insist that their happiness or unhappiness must be taken into account. And so it could turn out that an experiment that makes use of mice and rats, that inflicts pain on them, it could turn out that that experiment is wrong morally, because the expected pleasure that will be produced by that act is outweighed by the expected pain. So sometimes not performing an experiment can be the right thing to do, as opposed to performing the experiment. So animals must be taken into account. Now that idea may seem fairly new to you, but the reason I quoted Bentham in this long quotation in a footnote is Bentham Way back in the 1700s, the late 1700s, Bentham was already talking about animals as moral subjects. And I won't read the whole thing, of course, but at the very end of that long quotation, Bentham says, it may come one day to be recognized that the number of the legs, a four-legged creature or a two-legged creature, the number of the legs, the velocity of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. Now he's talking about, he says earlier, the French, in fact, let me go back and start over because I started too late. The French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason why a human being should be abandoned without redress to the caprice of the tormentor. So Bentham is saying that the French, who are, in his view, an enlightened people, have come to believe that skin color or race is morally irrelevant. Many people divided up the world into different races, and they believe that certain races count more morally than others. Bentham said the French have already rejected that. Right? The French have rejected what we might call racism or racialism. He says it may one day come to be recognized that the number of legs and so on are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. What else is it that should trace the insuperable line? In other words, what is it that distinguishes, draws a line between beings who matter morally and beings who don't matter morally? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? But a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversable animal than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. But suppose the case were otherwise, what would it avail? What would it matter? The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Those are famous words by Jeremy Bentham. And I put them in this handout to show you that for Bentham, as for all subsequent utilitarians, including Mill, we can't limit our moral concern to human beings. Yes, human beings who can suffer matter, and we must take them into account. But so do animals, at least most animals, certainly mammals. They can suffer, therefore they must be taken into account in our moral deliberations and in our moral thinking. We can't just treat them as though they were things. That may have been the case. Many people today may still think of animals as mere things or property. But Bentham and other utilitarians reject that. So people who are concerned about the welfare of animals are drawn to this theory, utilitarianism, precisely because it accommodates animals. And notice that if animals count, then it may be that a particular action that benefits human beings turns out to be wrong because the suffering and pain of the animal outweighs the pleasure brought about for human beings. And that's what I meant when I said a moment ago, a particular painful experiment on animals may have to be rejected for moral reasons because the expected benefits of the experiment are outweighed in terms of pleasure and happiness, are outweighed by the amount of pain and suffering inflicted on the animals who are part of the research. So that's a radical thought. That's another reason Bentham's writings were so shocking to people. Not only was he a leveler, he said everyone counts, he insisted on bringing animals into the picture and giving them moral status. Now, Bentham is not stupid. In fact, Bentham was the opposite of stupid. Bentham was a genius. Bentham was not saying that animals should get to vote or drive cars. That's absurd. They're not capable of doing those things. What Bentham is saying is that animals have a quality, a feature, a characteristic that all by itself entitles them to moral concern. And that is their sentience, their capacity to suffer. All right? So Bentham is not in favor of educating animals in schools, giving them rights to drive and so forth. That's inappropriate. That they can't benefit from any of that. But they can benefit from not having pain inflicted on them. Okay, next point, number 5. What if it turned out, contrary to my example, what if it turned out that those final values were all negative? Okay, just to use this, what if it came out instead of +7, +10, +3, what if it worked out -7, -10, -3? What that would mean is that no matter which act we perform, the world will be less happy. And that's tragic. But there could be a situation where no matter what you do, you're going to make the world a worse place. Okay? That's a terrible dilemma to be in. But the utilitarian would insist that there still is a right answer to the question, what should you do? What's the right thing to do? And the answer, as you can probably guess, is to minimize unhappiness. So if it were -7, -10, -3, the right act would be -3. Okay? In this case, act C. Right? Because a world with 3 additional units of pain in it is a better world than one that has 7 additional units of pain or 10 additional units of pain. So always do the best you can, whether it's maximizing happiness or minimizing unhappiness. Okay, it's a bottom line theory. Look at those final values and pick the best one. Okay, a couple more things. Now I'm going to use Adolf Hitler as my example. Philosophers like to do that because there's widespread consensus that Adolf Hitler was an evil person. Right? If I pick someone else, maybe there would be disagreement about whether that person is evil. But I pick Hitler because I think almost everybody agrees he was evil. Does Hitler's happiness or unhappiness matter to a utilitarian? In other words, what if individual S was Hitler? Does Hitler get counted? Or maybe we should just say Hitler was evil, so we don't care whether our actions cause him to suffer. The answer is Hitler must be taken into account. To a utilitarian, everyone's happiness counts and counts equally, even the happiness or unhappiness of evil people. And if we flip it around, take someone who's widely considered to be virtuous, a good person, Mother Teresa. Right? Mother Teresa's happiness or unhappiness gets counted as well. And it doesn't get counted any more than anyone else's just because she's good. Hitler doesn't get discounted because he's evil. Mother Teresa doesn't get counted more because she's good. Everybody gets counted. Everybody's happiness gets counted. Remember Bentham's dictum. Everybody to count for one, nobody to count for more than one. So Hitler's happiness gets taken into account. Finally, what about sadists and masochists? Let's take them one at a time. A sadist is someone who takes pleasure in inflicting pain on other people. So suppose a sadist is deriving pleasure from someone else's pain, causing pain to someone. Do we have to count that sadist's pleasure? The answer, as you can probably guess, is yes. The happiness or pleasure of sadists gets counted. Sadistic people. What about masochists? Masochists are people who enjoy experiencing pain. So it's kind of hard to sort out. A masochist, I suppose, is someone who derives pleasure from pain. Most people would experience it as pain. The masochist experiences it as pleasure. Does that pleasure get counted? The pleasure of a masochist? Yes. So all of these considerations that I'm bringing out right now are designed to help you understand the theory. Everyone gets counted and gets counted equally. By the way, if you're wondering why don't we want to take Hitler's badness into account or Mother Teresa's goodness, it's because that would introduce a new moral value into the picture. One of the things that is attractive about utilitarianism is that it takes only one thing into account. It looks at only one thing. How much happiness will be produced by this act as opposed to alternative acts that I could perform instead? If we take into account the goodness or badness of the individuals whom we're causing pain or pleasure to, now we've got a complicated calculation. We've got to look at two things: how much pleasure and pain we're causing, and how good or bad the recipients of that pleasure and pain are. So we're going to have two different values, and you can't always maximize two different things. And we'll see that next time in the second lecture this week. We'll see why U sub 8 gets rejected, because it's telling us to maximize two different values. So this Bentham was quite an interesting guy, don't you think? He considered himself the Newton of the moral world. Isaac Newton, as you know, was a great scientist, a great theoretical scientist, and he revolutionized science with his calculations and his formulae and his empirical discoveries. Bentham hoped to do for morality what Newton did for science. Right? Bentham wanted to put morality on a secure, indeed a scientific footing. This whole philosophic calculus, as you can see down here, was meant to be rigorously scientific. You should be able, two or more people looking at the same set of actions should be able to come up with the same numerical values when they looked at intensity, duration, certainty, proximity, and so on. Bentham wanted to make morality mathematical and scientific. So he, maybe this shows he had a big ego, but he thought of himself as the Newton of the moral world. Now, some people laugh at Bentham. Not only do they not consider him a great thinker, but they disparage him. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher you may have heard of, Nietzsche called all of the English utilitarians flatheads. Flatheads. Mill, Bentham. Nietzsche thought that they were simpletons. They took morality, which is a complex, rich thing, and they reduced it just to one thing: maximizing net utility, understood as pleasure in the absence of pain. So utilitarians have been mocked, ridiculed, laughed at, and so on. But Bentham and Mill thought that they were onto something, and their theory, I can tell you, remains alive and well in the modern world. What is it now, 2021? Bentham and Mill have been dead for a long time, as has Henry Sidgwick, but their theory lives on. There are today in philosophy departments all over the world, economics departments, there are people who call themselves utilitarians, who believe it's the correct approach to individual morality and public policy. So the debate goes on. How you come out on the debate is up to you. You may, by the end of the course, having looked at a number of theories, you may conclude that you are yourself a utilitarian. You may, on the other hand, reject it for the reasons Nietzsche gave. Too simple. It's a theory for simpletons, right? It reduces morality to maximization of pleasure. And life is about far more than that. Morality is about far more than pleasure. Okay, let's move on now. Now that you have a better understanding of Bentham's calculating machine, Let's look at some more defective formulations of Mill's principle. So I want to look at today 4, U sub 4, U sub 5, U sub 6, and U sub 7. And we'll stop there because that is the correct formulation. So in the next 10 minutes or so, let's cover the rest of these. U sub 4 goes like this. An act is right if and only if its utility is greater than 0. So someone might think that that's the correct formulation, right? We should always, what makes an act right is that it has a positive net utility. But we've already seen in one of our examples that that may not be possible. It may be that whatever we do, there's a net negative utility, right? -10, -7, -3. In which case, according to U sub 4, no act would be right. Do you see why? U sub 4 says an act is right if and only if its utility is greater than 0. So that implies that if a particular act has utility less than 0 or 0, it's wrong. But that can't be correct because there may be a case where all of the acts have a negative utility, in which case there still has to be a right act. There always is a right act, according to utilitarianism. Sometimes the right act is making the best of a bad situation, but there's always a right act. Any formulation of utilitarianism that implies that sometimes there's not a right act has to be an incorrect formulation. And that's why we need to reject U sub 4. Wrong acts can have positive utility, and right acts can have 0 or negative utility. So U sub 4 may look promising, but as soon as you start thinking about it, you can see it has serious, fatal problems. So let's modify U sub 4 and go to U sub 5. U sub 5 says an act is right if and only if its utility is very high. Well, the first and obvious problem with that is the word very is vague. Remember, Bentham wanted his theory to be rigorous, scientific, mathematical, or perhaps arithmetical is better because we're adding and subtracting. We can't formulate a theory with a vague term like very, very high. How high is that? 10 units, 20, 30, 40, 100. So the first problem with U sub 5 is that it's too vague to be useful. But also, right acts can have utility that's not very high. Maybe the fossil case. Remember the graduate student who used the bone as a toothpick? That probably brought about just a little bit of pleasure, maybe 1 unit, 1 hedon. And yet, that was the wrong act to perform. What about not the fossil case, the snakebite case? That act was right, we believed intuitively, and it didn't bring about any pleasure. In fact, it inflicted some pain. So doesn't the snakebite case serve as a counterexample to U sub 5? There can be a right act that does not produce very high utility. Okay? So U sub 5 is unacceptable. Let's move on to U sub 6, which gets pretty close to what we need. It says, an act is right if and only if its utility is higher than the utility of any other act the agent could have done instead. Higher than anything else. So in our example on this handout, which act of those 3, if any, produces utility that's higher than the utility of any other? It's Act B, because plus 10 is higher than any of the others. The problem with U sub 6 is that there could be a tie. What if there were a tie at the top of the ranking? What if, unlike this example, what if it came out plus 10, plus 10, plus 7? If you apply U sub 6 to that example, it blows a fuse. Why? Because in that example, there's no act that has utility higher than the utility of any other act. It's as high as one other act, but it's not higher than. So the problem with U sub 6 is that it cannot handle ties, a tie at the top of the ranking. Now, Feldman has a nice discussion of this. He introduces what I call the twin case. A father has two girls who are twins. He has one piece of unbreakable candy. He can't, because it's unbreakable, he can either give the candy to the first twin, or he can give it to the second twin, or he can give it to neither of them. And if he gives it to the first twin, it will produce a certain net utility. If he gives it to the second twin, it will produce the same net utility. If he gives it to neither twin, obviously there will be no utility at all, maybe even some pain or suffering, because the twins are going to be upset that neither one of them got the candy. So in the twin case, according to Feldman, U6 yields or produces the bizarre result that nothing the father can do would be right, for none of the acts mentioned has higher utility than all the others. Now, we can tweak U sub 6 to solve this problem. Instead of saying that an act is right if and only if its utility is higher than all the others, why don't we say it's at least as high as any other? In other words, and because that would allow for ties at the top of the ranking. So here is the final correct formulation of act utilitarianism according to Feldman. It's U sub 7. And he states it on page 26. Here we go. An act is right, i.e. permissible, if and only if there's no other act the agent could have done instead that has higher utility than it has. If you apply that theory to the twin case, it turns out that giving the candy to the first twin is right because no act is higher than it is in terms of utility, and giving the candy to the second twin is also right because no other act has higher utility than it has. So giving the candy to the first twin is right. Giving it to the second twin is right. Not giving it to either twin is wrong, forbidden. So sometimes utilitarianism produces discretionary actions. Sometimes you get discretionary actions whenever there's a tie at the top of the ranking. So remember what discretionary means? It's right to do it, and it's right not to do it. So giving the candy to the first twin is right, but so is giving the candy to the second twin. So we can say that the act of giving the candy to the first twin is discretionary. We can say that giving the candy to the second twin is discretionary. It's up to the father which twin to give it to. Now, what would you do in practice in a case like that? I would first of all explain to the twins exactly what my reasoning is. Now, of course, it would require that they be old enough to understand it. But I would say, look, girls, I love both of you equally. I want you to be happy. I have a piece of candy, and you can see that it's unbreakable, and I have only one piece. The one thing I don't want to do is not give it to either of you, because that would be to waste a source of happiness. And I hope you can see that if I give it to either one of you, the amount of happiness will be the same, whichever one I give it to. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to flip a coin. I'm going to adopt a procedure that gives each of you the same chance of ending up with the candy. And I hope that the one who doesn't end up with it will accept that it was a fair procedure. So is that fair? Should I flip a coin? And I'm sure the girls, if they could understand it, would say, yes, that's a fair procedure. We understand exactly what your predicament is. And I'd rather my sister have the candy than nobody to have it. And as long as I had the same chance to end up with it as she does, I accept it. Okay? So that would be the resolution, I think, of a utilitarian. Find a fair way to decide which twin gets the candy. So Feldman concludes, and I'm almost done now. Feldman concludes on page 26, principle U sub 7 is a formulation of act utilitarianism. It is the doctrine that many philosophers feel Mill meant to defend. So all of the work that we've been doing so far in chapter 2 was building up to this moment. I hope it's not anticlimactic. We started off reading what Mill actually wrote. We noticed there were some odd features of it, which caused us to make decisions about how to interpret it. And once we decided how to interpret it, we worked through a series of formulations. And whenever we arrived at a formulation, we tried to find problems with it. And we did every time until we got to U sub 7. U sub 7 doesn't suffer from obvious counterexamples. That doesn't mean it's the correct theory of morality or rightness, but it does seem to be the one that Mill intended. Okay? Again, let me say that I'm not claiming, nor is Feldman claiming, that U sub 7 is the correct account of right and wrong. Right? There are other theories we haven't even looked at yet, and we haven't looked at problems with U sub 7. All we're doing right now is saying that, Feldman and I, all we're saying is that this appears to be what Mill had in mind when he wrote those words long ago. Okay, let's stop there. When we meet on Thursday, it'll probably be Thursday, my second lecture this week, I'm going to talk about some of the features of U sub 7. It's consequentialist, it's hedonistic, it's monistic, and it's maximizing. You don't need to know right now what those mean, but I'm going to start with that next time. And then I'm going to get to the final section of chapter 2, and we'll talk about 2 more defective formulations of U sub 7. So I suspect that the lecture for Thursday won't, won't take even an hour. Today's lecture, I can see, is 102. We're a little over an hour, probably even shorter on Thursday. And I'll stop there. I don't want to get started on the next chapter. I'm going to stop. As soon as we get done with this material on Thursday, I'll stop, even if it's only 45 minutes in. Okay, that's enough for today. Have a great day and tomorrow, and I'll always send you an email when I get the lectures posted. So see you probably on Thursday.